we've got something a wee bit different. We've got Nancy Stuart here, who has had a really interesting work life, travelling the world, and she's a local lass who's been to see the world, and we would like to hear about it. So please welcome Nancy.
I'm not sure what you expect of me tonight. I was a civil servant, as was my husband, and we worked for the Department for International Development, which administered the British aid programme overseas. That, at that time, was a wing of the Foreign Office. In 2020, DFID combined with the Foreign Office, and it's now the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. I'm sure everybody is aware that by paying taxes, you all contribute to the British aid programme. And currently, that stands at around £13 billion to go to overseas aid. I'm going to talk tonight about, not so much about the projects that we did, that was more my husband's province, but what I did and how life in these countries was. I can easily give a speech to cover the opening of the public health centres that my department funded in remote areas. I was given a goat by a captain of the village on one of these occasions, a live goat. I've given a speech when we presented vehicles to the restoration of Paramount Chiefs programme, another of our early projects in Sierra Leone. And I talked my way out of a possible hostage situation when my driver and I were held up by the rebels at a roadblock. I also attended the ceremonial burning of arms with the President of Sierra Leone to mark the end of the Civil War. We were also involved with the demobilisation and disarmament and reintegration of the rebels. On one occasion, my secretary in the office screamed, and there was a soldier had just come in with an AK-47 over his shoulder, and she was terrified because these local people had lived for 10 years with light rifles and bombing and goodness knows what all. But the reintegration office was just up the road from our office, so I had to come out and escort this rebel with an AK-47 over his shoulder up the road, and I thought, if my daughters could see me now, they would. However, that's just one of the many things. When we worked for the department, and when we felt the time was right, my husband applied for a full overseas posting. He'd carried out several short-term missions before this and got the bug to see at first hand how the government's aid money was being spent. His first posting was to Barbadoes, which we spoke about, which was very nice for me, as we had agreed I would take a career break after having had major surgery for breast cancer and be a lady of leisure for a while. We didn't give aid to Barbados, but one of the things that we did do was help them to increase the sugar production. And what, after spending millions of pounds on consultants, they come up and said, just plant them closer together and you'll get more. The UK government, well, as I say, it didn't give aid to Barbados, but we did wonder on occasion if bringing people up to modern day standards was, in fact, helpful to them. We gave running water to the islands, but the standpipe in the village in a lot of these islands was where all the locals met and where a lot of social interaction took place. Were we doing away with that? Who knows? After some months, I was asked to join the management team at the British High Commission in Bridgetown, possibly one of the easiest but most frustrating jobs I've ever done, dealing daily with diplomats. That's another story, but I had an understanding boss in the High Commission. I was privileged to be able to travel to all of the islands. My husband covered the whole of the English-speaking Caribbean islands. One memorable day was spent on Necker Island, Richard Branson's Virgin Island. The spouses were entertained while the officers attended a conference in Virgin Gorda. The topic of the conversation was how to try and combat smuggling and to put in place an effective customs operation throughout the Caribbean. Most of the islands were the stopping off place for drug smuggling from South America. After 4 years in Barbados, excuse me, I apologise for reading this because at my age, if I try and talk, I'll forget the words, so bear with me. After 4 years in Barbados, which was termed a hardship post because of small island fever and lack of proper theatres, our next posting was a real hardship one in Georgetown, Guyana, South America. My husband had earlier had the unpleasant task of informing the Guyana government that the British aid programme to Guyana was being suspended until fair and free elections had been held. The British aid programme resumed after the elections took place in 1994, so we set off on what was to be 2.5 years of adventure for us. I should maybe backtrack a bit here and say that all the things I'm saying are from 17 years ago. I retired 17 years ago. I am not up to date. So some of this might have changed. A lot of it is probably the same. It's difficult for many to understand the fascination we held for Guyana, which at that time was the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The capital, Georgetown, was so run down, virtually no infrastructure, almost non-existent power supply, no sewage system, and no potable water. We couldn't even brush our teeth with the water that came through the taps. That was when we did get water through the taps. Most of our water was supplied by Bowser, and we bought all the water for drinking and cooking. The city sits below sea level, and during the rainy season, and this is 4 months of almost continual rain, the city floods and the potholes in the road become ponds. On more than one occasion, we were waist high in deep, muddy, smelly water. It's a miracle that we managed to survive our time there without catching some disease. There was no paid employment for me in Guyana, and once I had sourced accommodation for us, I needed something to fill in my time. I offered my services to hydrotherapy sessions to handicapped children. I'd been interested in swimming many years before, and we had the use of the swimming pool at the Georgetown Club, which was the same pool that the president used, and he came on several occasions while we were using it. It was amazing to see the children's reactions and how they enjoyed the freedom of being in and movement that being afloat in the water gave them. All our house guests were roped in to assist with these weekly sessions. It was not really a hardship because most of it was in brilliant sunshine. As we became more settled in Georgetown and our house needed less of my attention, and probably best that I wasn't there when electricians and plumbers, etc., were carrying out their dubious professions, I offered my time to another children's home some 25 miles from the capital in a village called Mahaika. This was a Leonard Cheshire home. I'm sure many of you will have heard of Leonard Cheshire and the sterling work that he carried out, starting with providing accommodation and assistance to injured soldiers after the Second World War. The organisation now has more than 250 homes for handicapped young people throughout the world. Because this home was in Mahaika, 25 miles from the capital, it had very few visitors and therefore little assistance from returning Guyanese who were happy to visit the home in the capital. The Guyanese are very generous people and more than willing to share what little they have, not unusual for someone on their birthday to provide treats for the handicapped children. But few of them had transport to get out of the city. There were 22 residents at this home, ranging from 9 to 30 years of age. all with varying degrees of mental and physical disabilities. Not sure if I'm correct politically in saying that these days, but the circumstances behind how the children found their way into the home are heartrending. One young lad was abandoned in a field eating whatever he could find. Another was left in hospital and his parents never returned to take him home. The poverty in Guyana to most of you would be incomprehensible, but a family faced with trying to feed several children, and this was when the average income was $1 a day, and then have one child who needed 24-hour care with medicines, etc., was more than most families could cope with. Most of the children suffered from spina bifida and cerebral palsy. I was given the choice of teaching sewing to the villagers in the Haika or setting up some sort of reading group for the children in the surrounding villages. I chose the latter, and after sending many begging letters to various organisations, I was able to set up a small lending library using a disused shed at the home for this purpose. Later on, I have some photographs that some of you might like to look at. This not only provided a place for the villagers to come, but also provided amusement for the residents of the home, who were delighted to see new faces. It was a completely new concept for most of the local people. Some of the children and mothers had never seen or held a storybook. And after a few weeks, it became apparent that the mothers always wanted a picture book. So we set up a literary class for the adults. We soon realised they couldn't read. I was eventually able to pass on the running of this library to a very able young Canadian volunteer. And this enabled me to concentrate on fundraising for the home, which received a very small subvention from the Guyana government and occasional help from the Leonard Cheshire Foundation, but relied mainly on donations to buy food, medicines, clothing, and to pay the hard-working care attendants. I unashamedly used my husband's position to allow me to access various organisations and government ministries where I begged for help. I became known as the beggar. Once a month we held a jumble sale, my mantra being that if you had clothes, ladies listen, if you had clothes in your wardrobe that you hadn't worn for a year, you didn't need them. You could give them to me. The same in your store cupboard in the kitchen. If you had something there for more than 3 months, the same, we could use them. I belonged to the Diplomatic Spouses Association surely for the purpose that I could source lots of things to sell each month. And when the Brazilian ambassador was refurbishing his residence, he gave me most of the redundant furniture to pass on to the home. So my fame as a beggar was spreading. One of our main fundraisers was a walk from the home to Georgetown, the capital, a distance of 25 miles, which my husband walked, pushing Mark in a wheelchair. Mark was a 17-year-old, severely epileptic, without the use of his legs, and with the mind of a 10-year-old, but the body of a young man. He talked to Ian constantly for 25 miles and expected answers. I even had the Prime Minister take part in the last few miles of the walk. For some reason, he'd taken a shine to me and was very glad to take part, although the only T-shirt we had left by this time was much too small. But he bravely put it on and marched along with the others. My role in this walk was to drive at the rear of the march, collecting any stragglers or sufferers, and collecting all the money as we went through all the villagers en route. I had been in local radio before the walk, spreading the word about what we were going to do, and amazingly, so many of the villagers did put money in our tins. As I mentioned earlier, the Guyanese are such a kind-hearted nation and would share their last with anyone in need. I mentioned earlier that our time in Guyana was full of adventures, and this certainly was the case. We were providing aid to most of the country, which was inaccessible by road. So we travelled a lot in small 6-seater airplanes, often sitting beside Malcolm Chanasu, our Afro-Chinese pilot, who had trained at Skun and whose wife was from Kilmacombe. Small world, are crossing the many rivers in speedboats, which in actual fact were rowing boats with an outboard sometimes attached. On my first trip into the interior, I sat beside Malcolm as he piloted his small plane and negotiated landing in a flat area near a remote village. These villages all have headmen, or captains, as they are known. This captain came forward, surrounded by all the children from the village, who all knew that Malcolm would have sweets for them. We were duly introduced. That day we were travelling with the finance minister and the head of customs, and my husband, who was introduced as the AIDS minister. Not quite correct, but Ian had long since given up correcting this title. When I asked the captain his name, he duly told me it was McBurney. So we Scots do get everywhere. After this trip, I never travelled without a supply of biscuits, pencils and notepads for the children, who were all eager to learn. We used to visit an Amerindian village on a mission, they were called, on Sundays. It was reached by crossing scrubland and keeping our fingers crossed in the hope that we were travelling in the right direction. On one occasion, our Land Rover Discovery went through some deep water, just like in the advert, if you've seen the advert for Land Rovers, right over the roof of the vehicle. And a good advert for Land Rover in that we surfaced and kept going without a stop. On further trips, where there was water en route, I was assigned to walk in front of the vehicle with my shorts hiked as far as they would go to feel for possible dips. Now, this was in a land where snakes and alligators roam. I must have been mad. On another occasion, my sister and I travelled with my husband when he was visiting a remote cocoa plantation. Our journey started with an hour's drive to reach the river crossing port. We'd hired exclusively one of the river taxis. They were meant to carry a maximum of 15 passengers, but often had at least 10 more on board, which resulted in many fatalities, especially at night. However, as we always hired the whole boat, there was only a few of us in the boat making the crossing. After crossing the river, which took 40 minutes, this is one of the widest rivers in South America, we were then another hour by road to reach another river, where again we had arranged a boat to take us down the river, then up a creek to reach the plantation. After inspecting the cocoa plants and having the customary refreshment, we never knew what it was, you just ate it anyway, and often just with your fingers. It was time to set off on our return journey. On the way back down the creek, the boat ran out of fuel. We'd paid for enough to cover our journey, but the boatman had sold some of it. There we were, stuck in the creek with only one paddle and a timetable to catch our various forms of transport to take us back to the capital. After much discussion with the boatman, who wanted to travel across the estuary, where we would have probably landed out at sea in this wee boat, we tied up to the bank again and flagged down a passing Amerindian in a dugout canoe. This man agreed to take some money to buy us fuel at one of the points on the river's bank. He set off, and we were sure we would never see him again. We passed the time watching the turtles and fish and trying not to look at our watches. Much to our surprise, our canoeist arrived back with the fuel, and we set off about 2 hours later than planned. As a result, it was dark by the time we reached the final river crossing, and again, after much discussion, we decided to cross the river in darkness. The alternative was staying in the village hall, where we would almost certainly have been bitten by malaria-carrying mosquitoes. This was my sister's first visit to South America, first visit to a developing country, and she was there going, what are we going to do? Where are we going? What are we going to do? And she was puffing it away in her cigarette. And the consultant that we had with us, he was frantically rooking around trying to find a telephone to inform his wife about our delay. This was in a country where they had hardly any electricity. They had no mobile phones. Few people had phones. Anyway, we decided that we would cross in the darkness during an electrical storm. So it was actually quite magnificent. My husband and I were there looking at seeing all the wee islands and things being lit up. And the others, my sister and this consultant who was with us, desperately hiding under the tarpaulin, terrified, sure that we were going to be sink or something. However, we did manage to get home, and that was just one of our many adventures in Guyana, filled with adventure, but some might say foolhardiness. It was with great regret that we left Georgetown, and lots of tears were shed at the many farewell occasions. The Leonard Cheshire home put on such a wonderful concert for us, with the village children dancing and singing, and of course our special children beaming and not really understanding what was happening. After this, we'd arranged 4 weeks travelling through the Caribbean before coming back to the UK to take up posts in our headquarters. After 2 consecutive overseas postings, it was unlikely that we would be offered any more. However, 2 days before we were due to leave, we received a fax asking for our itinerary for the following few weeks. And while we were in Grenada, about 12 days later, we were asked if we would take up a posting in Accra, the capital of Ghana in West Africa. We've never worked out whether my husband was good at his job or headquarters just didn't want him back. But for whatever reason, we gladly accepted, and a few months later began our 9 years in West Africa. Ghana was relatively tame and civilised after Guyana, and we had a beautiful house and gardens, constant water and electricity supply, and supermarkets, which we hadn't had in Guyana, in South America. And they supplied most of what I needed. This started my love of supermarkets, and I still love going to a supermarket. When I came home and leave, I used to say to my daughters, will you come shopping with me? And they said, no, Mum, we've been to the supermarket this week. No, thank you. I was again employed by the High Commission as Transport and Security Officer, a fairly demanding position managing a guard force of 35 guards and 7 drivers. All our properties had 24-hour guards, as we'd had in Guyana. During our time in Ghana, there was a state visit by Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip, and I was part of the core team to organise this visit, which took 9 months in the planning. No details was left unturned or practised, and after the 4-day visit, which was the start of an African tour, we were never more than 2 minutes out in our timings. We did get a letter thanking us that and saying we were the best team of that tour. I'm not a royalist, but after that visit and seeing at close hand what the Queen did and how she dealt with it all, I was full of admiration for her. I was one of the 5 who met the royal party on arrival at the hotel we had taken over for the visit, and also one of the 15 who at the end of the visit had a private few minutes with the Queen. As our time in Ghana was nearing its end, our office began to make noises about Ian going to Sierra Leone, which at that time was still in the throes of the most bloody, senseless civil war in recent history. Ian resisted, saying that if he was to have a final posting before retirement, he didn't want it to be a real hardship one. Also, as one can imagine, our family were not too keen on the idea. However, we were repeatedly asked to consider the proposal and eventually took ourselves off for a weekend to Cape Coast to think about it. After covering all eventualities and preparing a wish list, we presented this to our headquarters, who quickly agreed to all our requests. In January 2000, we visited war-torn Sierra Leone for a quick visit Not as easy a journey from Ghana as one would expect. We flew to Conakry in Guinea in the most unsafe aircraft I've ever been in, then took the World Food Programme helicopter into Sierra Leone. After 3 days, we were eager to begin the work we knew was desperately needed in this forsaken country. Back in Ghana, we had all our belongings packed and ready for shipment to Sierra Leone. I'd left my job, we'd had our farewell lunches, etc. We'd had our official farewell dinner and was about to depart for some home leave when a call from London told us to switch on the BBC News. This was May 2000, and there had been another attempted coup in Freetown. All thoughts of travelling to Sierra Leone were put on hold as all expats, including our embassy staff, were again being evacuated. We eventually were able to take up post in Sierra Leone in September 2000. Our first task was to set up and staff an office we had identified on our earlier visit. My job was human resources and office manager. I dealt with the day-to-day running of the office, managed our local staff, and acted as personnel manager for the UK consultants we had coming to assist in the various disciplines. This meant finding accommodation for them both long and short term. Sounds a fairly easy task, but this was in a country that for 10 years had nothing but fighting, looting, destruction of all official buildings, schools, hospitals, etc., no maintenance of any description carried out on public utilities, and certainly no outside investment, and only one dubious hotel. Many of these consultants had previously worked in the developed world and were absolutely aghast at some of the accommodation we had to provide. Most of the reasonable houses in the area where we stayed had been left vacant for many years and had been looted by the rebels. Our own residence had been the German ambassador's place, but had been empty for 5 years, with the rebels having removed every door, light, and most of the sanitary ware. My husband was dismayed when I showed it to him, but he promised me 2 months to make it habitable. He was too busy creating a workable relationship with the Sierra Leone president and his cabinet. As in Guyana, electricity was in very short supply, so most of us had generators. We got used to living with the sound of these machines going constantly. Fortunately, only for part of the year was there a water problem, and the water we did get was of reasonable quality. We boiled all our water for drinking. After about 2 months, we were able to move into our house, although not for the entire time, 5 years that we lived there, did everything work simultaneously. And our generator seemed to break down much more than anyone else's. So dining by candlelight became quite the norm, which was good for the wrinkles. However, the Stuarts enjoy a challenge, so we got on with things as best we could. Although my husband and I were more concerned when travelling anywhere in the vehicle, there was a policeman sitting in the back of a vehicle with an AK-47 in his lap. We were more concerned about him than being attacked by rebels. And there was a curfew. Initially 9 p.m, then 11 p.m, and after about 2 years, midnight. I didn't know about the midnight one for quite a while. I was out with friends, came 11 o'clock, and I said, we have to get home. And they said, no, it's midnight. It's been midnight for a while. My husband hadn't told me because he quite liked getting home at 11 o'clock. However, the curfew was better than when we arrived, when it had been 6 o'clock. 2 days after arriving in Sierra Leone, I had occasion to visit a vocational centre in the east end of the city. This was the poorest part and the area where the rebels always struck first as they entered the city. I met the pastor who ran the vocational centre, which was housed in a partially constructed basement, and to which our department had donated some sewing machines, so that the females who had been released from the rebels after being held as sex slaves could learn a trade by which hopefully they would be able to support themselves. No matter that the girls had been held against their will, their families wouldn't accept them back after they had been with the rebels, nor could the families support any extra mouths while they were struggling themselves to survive. Some of the girls had been branded across their chests with RUF, Rebel United Front. One poor child tried to erase this by heating an iron and putting it against herself, so that she might get rid of the stigma of this. Through the kind services of mercy ships, charity-run hospital ships, which called into various troubled countries with medical assistance, I was able to arrange to have plastic surgery carried out on 2 of the girls. The same pastor who ran the vocational centre had also started up an organisation for war orphans. At this time, the home was a 3-bedroomed house with partial roof, earthen floors, window spaces that were covered in cardboard or pieces of cloth, 2 corrugated huts, one which served as a kitchen and one served as a bath, as a toilet. There were then 58 children at that time, ranging from about 3 to 13 years of age. The children were quiet, stunted, sick-looking individuals. And after seeing the sad eyes, I vowed I would help all I could during our time in Sierra Leone. Once again, my husband patiently listened to my tale of woe about these unfortunate children, and as before, agreed we could do what we could to help them. I can never thank him enough for his support, which enabled me to spend so much of my time and our money on making things better for these poor children who experienced things that no child should ever have had to. One little girl had seen her father beheaded in front of her. She didn't speak. 2 brothers witnessed their parents being burned in their hut and were made to watch. For the first 12 months or so, we concentrated on trying to clothe, feed and make the children healthier. This was all while I was doing a full-time job. So we didn't have much free time, and attending functions 3 or 4 times a week with my husband. But the children were living in such close proximity, 4 to 5 children to each bed. And whenever one caught something, it quickly spread. The children had no shoes, and walking on the earthen floor caused many problems, mainly an insect which worked its way under the skin and caused sores. We did try to treat the floor with chemicals, but it was useless. During a storm one weekend, the roof blew off the corrugated building that served as the village school. This was a disaster not just for the orphanage children, but for the 300 or so other children who attended school. Most children in Sierra Leone went to school, but the standard of teaching is very poor and the government doesn't pay the teachers. So there is a never-ending struggle to try to get proper teachers. I met on several occasions with the Minister for Education, both in his office and at official functions, and he always promised to do something, but it never materialised. We just didn't have enough money to pay in bribes. And of course, as a British government official, I couldn't be seen to condone bribery. However, back to the tale of the roof. The cost of replacement was going to be considerable, and we couldn't delay too much in trying to do this. So I sent an email letter to family, friends and colleagues, outlining the problem and asking for assistance. I was very quickly inundated with offers of help, and were soon able to purchase the necessary equipment to carry out the repairs. A British soldier who had become interested in the orphanage and the work we were trying to do arranged for 6 carpenters from the Sierra Leone Army to come along and carry out the work. Once the children overcame their fright at seeing soldiers in uniform at close hand, and seeing they were not carrying rifles, it was like a party for them, and the roof was soon in place. The response I received from this email, my begging email, set in motion a whole chain of events that prompted an article in our departmental magazine. As a result of this, none of my visiting colleagues arrived without boxes of books, clothes, etc. A pharmacy near Friends in Kent provided us with a year's supply of vitamins for the children. Another place sent boxes of pencils and so it went. People are very generous and only need a focus, which I provided. As mentioned earlier, all the children went to school, but the rough building we had repaired was too crowded and not really suitable. As part of the peace process, we had started a project called Community Reintegration Programme, a means of trying quickly to rehabilitate buildings and return them to their villages. It was not strictly in our mandate, but with some fudging, we were able to build a permanent school with 4 classrooms on top of the basement that housed the vocational centre. We'd first carried out checks to ensure that the building actually belonged to the organisation. It had been gifted to them by a lady whose husband had started the building, but who was killed during the war, and she had no means to continue it. While we had been in Guyana, my husband and I decided to forgo buying each other Christmas presents, and instead we provided cooked and served Christmas lunch to the children and staff at the Leonard Cheshire home. We decided to carry on with this tradition in Sierra Leone, so each Christmas Day for 5 years we transported the then 62 children and 6 helpers from the home to our house in police trucks. It's almost an hour's journey over tracks and non-existent roads. But the children passed the time singing hymns and enjoying being out of the orphanage. Fortunately, we had a huge terrace, and with many friends assisting, we gave the children chicken and rice, followed by jelly and ice cream. First year we were a bit dubious, as they'd never seen jelly or ice cream. And trying to serve this before it melted was another trial. Temperatures at Christmas were usually around about 30 degrees. We gave the children party hats, balloons, played games, and each one received a present. The first year the children were a bit apprehensive, but in subsequent years they grew to enjoy it and know what to expect. And even put on some of their own entertainment. One of the young lads was an especially gifted musician, and a friend of ours sponsored him to attend the music academy and gave him a guitar, so we always had something from him, as well as a dance display, but mostly by the boys. Over time, we had begun making improvements to the building where the home was. This had been given to the pastor a few years earlier, rent-free for 5 years. As it became apparent that some sort of stability was returning to the country, the family who owned the building decided they could make some money from it. We decided that if we refurbished the building to a good standard, the family may agree to letting it to us for a further 5 years at a much reduced rent. In order to fund this refurbishment, we decided to hold a fundraising event at our house. This started off as having maybe 20 to 30 people to supper who would pay to hear music played by a friend from the High Commission who had a jazz band and played at local bars. However, it soon snowballed and we ended up having 120 people to a sit-down 2-course meal. Everyone paid for a ticket and we had a waiting list. I had lots of helpers. We formed a committee. Everybody was doing bits and pieces. One of our colleagues managed to get enough bottles of wine to put 2 on each table. The premise being that once people had a few drinks, they would be more generous. In my role in the office, I had to sign cheques to local businesses, and in the build-up to our fundraiser, I included a personal letter with each cheque outlining what we were planning and asking for a donation for our raffle. I was astonished at the level of contributions. A cooker, TVs, microwave, etc. Paint. Instead of selling raffle tickets only on the night, we had a lot printed, proper tickets, and we sold the tickets throughout Freetown. These prizes were beyond the means of most of the people, so the opportunity to perhaps win one was tremendous. And so we forged ahead with planning this event, something that Freetown had not ever witnessed, certainly not in the recent years. Unfortunately, only 2 days before the big night, the pastor came to me with the dreadful news that they had been given notice to quit the building. This was devastating news for us, and as a result, my opening speech on the night was to tell everyone that the money raised would not refurbish the existing home, but would go to find new accommodation for the children. And so the evening festivities began. A busy group of helpers arrived at the table, another group served behind the bar, and all the time our friends in the band played terrific music. After the food and a fair amount of booze had been consumed, we started the auction. Well, it's difficult to put into words the enthusiasm shown by everyone and the strange things that were auctioned. One close friend agreed to have his beard shaved off. I had never seen him without it. That raised £100. Well, our chief of police, who was employed by us, he gave a poetry rendition, and we raised £100 for him to stop. And so it went on. 3 soldiers offered themselves as slaves for the day to carry out any task that was asked of them, as long as the price was right. Amazingly, our High Commissioner brought this one for 500 and daily used the slaves at his Christmas carol service, where instead of straw hats, they wore antlers on their heads. And so the night went on. We had a bottle of 25-year-old malt whisky in the house that my husband had been given as a present. He doesn't drink whisky. And as the auction going so well, we decided to put this forward. Couldn't believe our eyes when this raised 120. The next day, when we totaled all the cash, and it was in bundles of notes, the biggest note being at that time 5,000 leones, which was worth about £1.50. And all of it was dirty and smelly. I mean, the fishermen used to keep it in various parts. And I used to go into my office on a Monday morning and open the safe and go out of my office for a while all the smell from all the money came out. So it was not a very pleasant task counting all this money, but we raised the amazing figure of the equivalent of £5,200, which was unheard of for a charity event in this country, and a credit to all who had helped and contributed on the night. Throughout the night, I had various businessmen approach me with offers of accommodation, land, buildings, etc., to use as alternative accommodation for the home. But the best piece of news was from the managing director of Standard Chartered Bank in Freetown. Simon is Australian and had become a good friend. He had a community fund in his bank that he donated to worthy causes each year, and could we meet to discuss this, which we did a few days later. After many discussions with the officials from the bank and the pastor, it was decided that we would build a new home on land that belonged to the orphanage. This was a huge undertaking and dependent on us raising half the cost of the building, with the bank putting up the rest. My dream of giving each of these children their own bed was becoming closer, and so began more fundraising. Earlier that year, we'd had a visit from the Duchess of York in her role as patron of a charity called Children in Crisis. During her 4-day visit, she stayed at the High Commissioner's residence, but on one day of the official visit, the High Commissioner asked if I would accompany her, which I duly did. We visited the organisations in her programme and chatted a lot, and of course, I mentioned my orphanage. She said she would love to visit, but would we have time? In her busy day, there was about an hour for her to rest and change before we met the Minister of Social Welfare. The Duchess said if I was agreeable and if the Minister wouldn't mind that she wasn't changed, we could visit the home then. The Minister for Social Welfare and Children's Affairs was a good friend of mine, so I knew she wouldn't mind, but the bodyguard assigned to the Duchess said he couldn't deviate from the programme unless the High Commissioner agreed. I, of course, then phoned the High Commissioner and assured him the Duchess would come to no harm. And we duly paid a short call in the home, unannounced. I just said I was bringing a friend. Had I said who it was, it would have put everyone in a flap. The Duchess was very impressed, and on our journey back asked what the children most needed. At this time, we were still under the impression that we would refurbish the building, and I said that feeding the children was a major problem, and she immediately said she would help. At the end of our visit, I was invited to the High Commissioner's residence to have tea with her before she left. While it was just the Duchess and me, she gave me a present for myself and handed me $3,000 for the children, with the promise of the same again when she got back to the UK. And sure enough, a few weeks later, an envelope arrived for me from the Buckingham Palace in the diplomatic bag containing $3,000 in notes. As things had changed in the interim, we used some of this money towards what we now termed our building fund. We continued with fundraising. Potluck suppers, sales, friends and colleagues were also, back in the UK, were also raising money for us. And we reached at just under £30,000. The bank promised as much, so we decided we could now go ahead. We had a search done on the piece of land to again ensure it was legally belonged to the orphanage. Land tenure in Sierra Leone is very suspect, and the same piece of land is sold many times over. Once we had this and we arranged an architect to draw up plans, this was someone we had used in our official work, so he was willing to carry out this for us without cost. We then put out tenders and so the work began in earnest. There are some photographs here of the work as it went along, if anybody's interested. The only stipulation that the bank put on letting us have the money was that it all went through me, not to the local people. Sad, but true. No one trusted the locals. Corruption is a way of life in Sierra Leone, and not just the poor people, but at all levels. That's why my department had funded the Anti-Corruption Commission as one of our projects. And so started an exciting time excavating the land, which was on a hillside and which provided work to some of the locals who worked alongside the builders we had hired. It was amazing to see it all taking shape, a two-storey basic building with top floor the girls' dormitory and the ground floor for the boys, a huge dining communal area with a kitchen off, a paved yard with a well. We met with local traders to have bunk beds built. This was another new concept with no ladders to reach them. However, we eventually got it right and also had lockers constructed for each child. So my wish that they could all have somewhere to keep their few permissions was coming to fruition. After some delays, the building was eventually finished and we had a wonderful opening ceremony for the Stuart Children's Home, although I insisted the plaque should also mention Standard Chartered Bank, without whose assistance we would not have managed it. We had some lovely times at the new home, Easter being one. I used to boil 12 dozen eggs and we would roll half of them, then have a painting competition with the others. Even in 2005, the children were still drawing guns and cutlasses on the eggs. Their memories from earlier years were of fighting and killing. And that is something that they still have to deal with and something we could do little about. We couldn't change the past and erase their memories of what went on at the height of the war and the horrific scenes they had witnessed. During our time in Sierra Leone, we also assisted the Blind School and the Leonard Cheshire Home. There were so many deserving organisations and so little time and money. Sometimes I wished I wasn't working for the department so that I had more time, free time, and then I may have had more free time, but a lot less money with which to help. While all this was going on, I still had my day job and the enviable task of finding bigger premises for our office. It had been decided in London that we would open a country office with local delegated authority. This just meant we would be able to spend without having first to refer back to headquarters for approval. It also meant a lot more staff, and so we had a huge recruitment drive, plus meetings with builders, suppliers, etc. At this time, my husband, after staying on a year after normal retirement age, decided time was right for him to finish, although I had been asked to stay on for another year, to assist with the move to the bigger office and to train the new staff. Ian agreed he would stay in Sierra Leone with me and spending more time on the golf course. Golf course is a bit of a euphemism for what it was, but you could play. However, this was not to be, as he agreed to spend some months on a special mission in our office in Rwanda. I was able to visit him there, and we met up in Addis Ababa, where we both attended a conference. When my extra year was coming to an end, I was asked to stay on yet again, but by this time Ian was a house husband, and we didn't relish another rainy season in Sierra Leone. Headquarters were initially reluctant to lose what they said was someone with so much overseas experience, i.e. somebody who'll put up with a lot. I think that's what they meant. And they wanted me to go to Basra or Juba in Sudan. These were only 6-month postings, but nothing would persuade me to agree. I felt we had done more than our share of duty overseas, and so we left Sierra Leone in June 2006 and headed for a long-promised holiday, starting in the Lebanon, staying in Beirut. 24 hours we left Beirut, 24 hours before the bombing started again. So we just missed it all there. Since we left, life has been more family orientated. We got grandchildren, and that takes up our time, and more time spent on the golf course. There are some photographs here of different projects that we had, and these are just maybe not terribly interesting, but just gives a wee insight of what life was like in the various places. And this one is of the orphanage when it was started, before it was started, and as it progressed, if anybody wants to have a look. I hope I haven't bored you so much.